In 1670 Scotland, Agnes Mitchell, a servant girl of the Galt estate, lodged a complaint with the local township against her employer. She claimed Maud Galt, the mistress of the house, had been sexually abusing her and other staff with a phallus moulded from clay. Her accusations caused immediate uproar, and Galt was swiftly investigated. Not for rape or the crime of counterfeiting the office of the husband, but for witchcraft. As Julian Goodare explains, the shocked authorities found the idea of witchcraft easier to cope with than lesbianism. To this day, we have no way of knowing what happened to Galt. No commission was paid and no legal action was recorded. Yet centuries later, the case stands as an example of something many of us are familiar with. Lesbianism and witchcraft are inextricably linked in our culture. Hi guys, this is the Lilac Lens, and today I wanted to talk about two things I think we all know and love: witches and lesbians. To claim that witchcraft is innately sapphic may seem far-fetched. No, you don't have to be gay or a woman to be invested in mysticism, and no, the local couple down the road aren't going to sacrifice you to Satan. But as Nicole Pasulka explained for The Cut, when women were first organizing in the 60s and 70s, lesbians often looked for female-dominated or goddess-worshipping cultures as models for how to live and thrive outside of patriarchal Western society. Many of these goddess-worshipping cultures came with ancient pagan and Wicca practices, combining spiritualism with magic. Even the aesthetics and tools we associate with witchcraft today have their roots in lesbianism. Pamela Coleman Smith, the artist responsible for the standard design of tarot cards most commonly used to this day, remained unmarried to her death and was never linked to a man during her lifetime. She spent her later years running a home in Cornwall with a woman companion. Of course, we have no means of knowing what their relationship might have been, but lesbians have widely claimed her as a role model of a patriarchy-defiant black woman in an era where being such came at a great cost. With these legacies of witchcraft and lesbianism in mind, I'd like to draw your attention away from the historical and towards the pop cultural. With such a diverse and complex history of lesbianism and witchcraft, you may expect our screen culture to reflect this. It's all but a stereotype by now. Lesbian witches humming curses while they kiss their girlfriends good morning, black cat planted neatly between the two of them. And yet, it makes sense if we want to explore witches on screen to backtrack to the early years of cinema. In those glorious years before the Hays Code kicked in, there were not really many lesbian witch movies. I mean, it's understandable. The connection between lesbianism and feminism and Wicca wouldn't enter the mainstream until several decades later. These early years instead offer us an insight into how these connections began to form. The 1922 adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Salome, for example, explores female sexuality as a mythic weapon. The Dance of Seven Veils derives from an amalgamation of cultural practices: belly dancing, early stripteases, traveling acrobats. The act of stripping bare is a little too far for a filmic adaptation, but the nudity in the book is often read as a reclamation of her erotic power. Drawing from the Sumerian myth of Inanna, a goddess stripped bare as she descends into the hedonism of the underworld. Drawing from imagery of the celestial, the film connects the feminine body with cycles of the moon, highlighting the menstrual cycle as something beyond human. Female anatomy and the feminine body are sites of mysticism. The lead actress, Alla Nazimova, who also served as producer for the film, was a known lesbian. Her affair with the production designer of Salome, Nashta Rambova, and Oscar Wilde's own niece, Dolly Wilde, grounds the film's magical realist feminism with lesbian identity. Salome is not so much about witchcraft, drawing more on implications of female sexuality as a supernatural weapon, but its production is certainly rooted in lesbianism. The 1970s marked major shifts in the fabric of society across the globe. Feminism was gaining new ground across the US, Europe, and Asia. Questions of bodily autonomy became central to the feminist activism in the Americas and Japan. while questions of class mobility were dissected in India and across Europe. Simultaneously, two other major movements were making waves during this time. Gay liberation had been thrust into the mainstream, with the Stonewall riots kicking off protests and activism across the globe. Demonstrations in San Francisco were followed closely by the Front de Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaires hijacking of homophobic broadcasts in France, and the first gay power march in Europe in 1971. At the same time, the new religious movement was beginning to find attention in the mainstream. After World War II, Japan's government was pressured into separating Shinto from the state, entering Japan into a new era of religious freedom and making space for the emergence of dangerous cults in the coming years. In the late 1960s, the US saw the emergence of alternative religions, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and LaVey's Church of Satan. It was an era of queers, an era of feminists, and, of course, an era of witchcraft. The horror films of this era didn't shy away from these themes. The battle of queer and satanic forces against the normative play out through the female victim. Women are framed as helpless bystanders, corrupted by homosexuals and supernatural forces beyond comprehension. Women are good and helpless and weak. Queer women are demonic, inhuman, and perhaps not women at all. However, these depictions are not always blanket condemnations, despite their dehumanizing tendencies. Take, for example, the 1971 French film Girl Slaves of Morgana Le Fay. I'm gonna have to spoil the whole film here, so if it sounds like a movie you'd be interested in, I really do recommend giving it a watch. It's something that I actually really enjoyed a lot more than I expected to, but I will warn you it is very explicit. It's so explicit. The film follows two girls, Francois and Anna, who take refuge in a barn deep in the French countryside during a post-college retreat. After Anna touches and kisses Francois in her sleep, Francois wakes up to a strange and surreal world. Lured away to the castle of Morgana Le Fay, Francois is seduced by the mistress of the house, who attempts to lure her into her harem. Anna, meanwhile, is bound in the dungeon, forced to submit to the immortal harem or be locked away to age and die in the basement. Anna, of course, falls more easily into submission, while Francois resists, eventually escaping back into the real world. But here's where things get interesting. To escape, Francois seduces one of Morgana's closest companions. We watch her wield Yale's sexuality against her, sharpening sapphic desire into a weapon to render her helpless as Francois steals her invisibility cloak. As Francois flees, she exits the dense forest to find herself at a graveyard, returning not only to reality, but to the Christian culture of 20th century France. She watches as a funeral procession passes. An elderly woman follows, staring distantly. Francois rushes back to the forest, returning to the arms of Morgana, who leads her back to the embrace of Anna. And that's interesting, right? The film diverts from the simplistic morality tale it initially presents by indulging the character's desires. Refusing to submit to heteronormativity is framed as the ultimate reclamation of autonomy. It becomes a way to escape, a way to never grow old. Lesbianism here is the magic. There's something to be said about the sex in this film too. If you continued without watching the film, I cannot stress enough just how explicit it is. Lesbian sex is erotically and lavishly shot, not something shameful or perverse. However, one of the first sex scenes in the film is framed through the eyes of Morgana's one male slave, Garth, who comments on what a wonderful view it is. It's hard to shake the sense that the film views lesbian pleasure as male-oriented, even without men in the room. And yet, when Francois returns to Morgana's realm, Garth is already long dead. She flees the heterosexual world to a world entirely devoid of men, and any hot lesbian sex she has from there on in, we just aren't privy to. With the voyeuristic male gaze dismantled, the audience's voyeurism is also denied. Now, this film is somewhat of an exception. The homosocial relationships in Nobuhiko Bayashi's house can't defeat the heterosexual despair and desire of the witch. In contrast, Suspiria's Susie overcomes and slays the reanimated corpse of her homoerotic friend, effectively overcoming the evil witchcraft by rejecting the law of homosexuality. Yet, looking back to this era of witch cinema, we can begin to understand that these texts are much more complex than they may initially appear. Feminism and lesbianism were in the zeitgeist, and the connections between lesbianism and witchcraft were extremely prevalent, perhaps more so than in decades to come.
Us together without the magic.
There was plenty of magic.
You all knew this one was coming. Following the 1970s, the 80s saw a dangerous spike in the hysteria around witchcraft. The Satanic Panic was very real and ruined a lot of lives. The fear of the occult particularly targeted queer women, with the horrifying case of the San Antonio Four. In 1994, 4 Latina lesbians were falsely accused and convicted of ritualistic occult sexual abuse of 2 young girls by the girls' homophobic and abusive father. As Mike Ware, executive director of the Innocence Project of Texas, said of the case, the accusations sort of gave law enforcement what they needed. They're gay. The other. Who knows what they're up to? Where most media of this era shied away from these contentious topics, Buffy was already steeped in the occult. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Season 3, Episode 11, Gingerbread, the character of Willow has an emotionally fraught coming out scene. Not as queer, but as a witch. These kinds of parallels had been played with before, with the previous season ending on Buffy kicked out of her house for harboring a dangerous secret that she couldn't tell her mum about.
You walk out of this house, don't even think about coming back.
I'm like halfway through filming right now, and I've been like awkwardly kneeling up, and I just realized I don't have to do that. I can get a thing. The show doesn't shy away from the stereotypes around coming out. Stereotypes that weren't really mainstream yet. Lines like,
And we're gonna make some changes. I don't want you hanging out with those friends of yours.
ring upsettingly and uncannily true for many coming out experiences, especially in the 90s. This scene marked the beginning of the show directly associating magical practice with queer identity. In the following season, with the introduction of Willow's new love interest, Tara, a woman, the show doubles down. Willow first meets Tara at a college Wicca club, which she quickly realizes is full of fakes, feminists using the name of Wicca with no desire to explore the true depths. Except Tara. There's plenty to say here about how the show views real-life Wicca and real-life feminists who take on the Wicca name. There's a clear line drawn between the real witchcraft of Willow and Tara and the fake witchcraft of the other girls. Whether you read this as a rejection of heterosexual women co-opting queer practice, or as Joss Whedon drawing a line between his fictional witches and the fake feminist witches in his audience, is largely hard to pass. As with a lot of Buffy, the intentions are blurry at best, and no reading is really the correct one. With Tara's introduction, magic shifts from a primarily individual personal practice to a communal interpersonal one. Magic becomes more than simply a metaphor. It becomes queer action in space where the culture isn't ready for lesbian affection to be overt. As Claire Heuchan describes, Buffy always stops short of showing physical intimacy between Willow and Tara. Scenes of their shared spells, complete with candles and breathy sighs, acted as substitute. And yet, they still stopped short. For the first full season of Tara's lifetime in the show, Willow and Tara were allowed to hold hands and make innuendos. They didn't kiss until mid-season 5 and weren't allowed to make clear references to lesbian sex until season 6. Though magical lesbian orgasm musical number does kind of feel worth the wait, I think. This isn't to say Buffy solved the fear of lesbianism and witchcraft. Things were still rough. Across the Pacific, titles like Echo Echo Azarak, which feature not one but 2 evil lesbian witches, had a very negative portrayal. The main lesbian witch of Echo Echo Azarak is a pedophilic schoolteacher whose obsession with her student leads her to literally crucify her. Witchcraft was a narrative tool to corporealize the threat of lesbianism, and that just doesn't go away easily. Something you may have noticed throughout this video is that a lot of the examples I have of real lesbian witches are black women, and the women in the media I'm analyzing are very much not. The racialized aspects of sapphic identity and satanic prosecution are largely unaddressed in these texts. The aesthetics of witchcraft as we know it today borrows as much from Celtic and pagan cultures as it does from South American and Native American cultures. This blending of practices crosses many boundaries into close spiritual and cultural traditions, while labeling them as witchcraft, a slanderous colonial label for many natives. 1996 The Craft features an African American witch, played by the truly exceptional Rachelle True, who takes revenge on her racist bullies through witchcraft. The film has been praised as a queer classic to many weird lesbians, a close group of girls messing around with magic together and torturing the boys who won't leave them alone. There's certainly material there. But the film's desperation to condemn witchcraft and wield pagan superstitions around magic and curses becomes a blanket condemnation of vengeance. Rachelle is not allowed to fight back against the vitriolic racism she faces because the white guy writing the script is super scared of black teenage girls gaining any leverage on their oppressors. That's a harsh reading of the text, and many black women, especially black sapphic women, have voiced both their discomfort with and affinity for the character of Rachelle. As Ashley Blackwell writes for Graveyard Sisters, I was flustered and empathetic to a character that was virtually invisible to an entire school population outside of a small coven of comrades, unless it be the unchecked target of racial scorn. Though she goes on to express dissatisfaction with the film's inability to dig into the character and question her role within a group of white girls who could one day sit at the table, one Rachelle would never be offered a seat at. When it comes to witches of colour, there just aren't many POC witches in media. One of the few examples is Sarah Fear in Netflix's Fear Street trilogy. We're shown Sarah Fear's story through the body of Dana, played by Kiana Madeira, a mixed-race actress. This casting, while offering us familiar faces to empathize with as the horrors unfold, also overlays a racial element. Sarah Fear is invited into the woods for what is later framed as a dance with the devil by a village girl we later learn she has feelings for. As a curse kills the village's livestock and a possession leads to the brutal slaughter of the village children, hysteria begins to set in. Sarah confides in a friend who attempts to blackmail her into a relationship, only to be revealed as the true evil cursing the town. He betrays her to the townsfolk, who hang her for her perceived crimes, as she screams a curse for generations to come. The imagery of the hanging unambiguously reveals a parallel between the prosecution of witchcraft and the lynching of Black Americans. Sarah, as a queer perceived witch in the 1600s, and Dana, a queer black woman in the 1990s, are kindred in their oppression. Queerness, in this case, is also fundamental in Sarah's indictment. Betrayal of good is both homophobic and patriarchal, reducing Sarah to a commodity to be had and, once rejected, a villain to be slain. Sarah's tragedy reveals the interconnectedness many queer witch films and shows refuse to engage with. The prosecution of witches does not exist in a vacuum. Women are drawn to the label of witch as reclamation of specific misogynistic hysteria. Queer and black women further see their experiences reflected in the horror of the witch trials. As Sylvia Federici explains of her own interest in the historical witch trials, witches represent female subjects that capitalism had to destroy. The heretic, the healer, the disobedient wife, the woman who dared live alone, the obey her woman who poisoned the master's food and inspired the slaves to revolt. These women were not prosecuted for witchcraft, and the draw of witchcraft for queer women is not solely in the practice itself. The aesthetic and practice which defines witchcraft offers identification with a history of queer women, a non-patriarchal belief system, and an oppressed identity which feels synonymous with our own. It's kind of strange seeing it all laid out like this, just how many and how few lesbian witches we actually have. I started this project during a Buffy rewatch, just trying to find more of Willow and Tara in the places that the show disappointed me, which sadly was a lot more than I was expecting. I consider this video more of a retrospective, but the patterns are certainly quite telling. I didn't get to talk about every lesbian witch movie or show out there, and certainly not at length. I'm not a big American Horror Story fan, so I didn't go back to Coven for this, and actually, of all the witch films I watched for the first time while researching this, the original Echo Echo Azarak film is probably my favorite, and I only mentioned it very, very briefly. I really do recommend that film if you have to watch just one of all the things I recommended here, even though it has a kind of difficult relationship with lesbianism and some elements that have certainly not aged fantastically. It's a very, very, very fun series of films that I think deserves a lot more love from the international J-horror community. Obviously, the main ties between witchcraft and lesbianism is a history of persecution. The terror of women empowered to forgo the trappings of heterosexuality and normativity. Oh, how scary. But that's not an entirely fair comparison. Witches aren't scary because they're feminists. Witches kill people and curse people and reign in terror. As fun as a lot of early witches can be to watch, the evolution of the lesbian witch away from a demonic force and towards a tragic or romantic figure is a powerful and really important one. The modern relationship between witches and lesbians is one of reclamation. It's a defiant and powerful cry. You can't burn us now. Because we're still here. Witches, lesbians, heretics, queers. We're still here. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is my first time making a video like this. I literally had to buy like a ring light and mic just for this, all secondhand, mind you. And I really enjoyed this experience, and I really hope this is something that I can do more of as time goes on. I do hope to have like a every 3-week upload schedule. I will have a video out for Halloween, so please look forward to that. If you want more of me, more things queer and spooky and media, especially world cinema. I love talking about world cinema and international pop culture and the ways that media kind of travels is all really interesting to me, and I really want to get the chance to talk more about that kind of thing, especially through a queer lens, of course. So please, yeah, like, subscribe, hit the bell, whatever you do, and I hope I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!